Gawain looked appraisingly at Amber as she threw her captive to the ground. "Well done! We'll make a bodyguard of you yet!" Amber stuck out her tongue at him. "Try not to look so surprised, Grand Duke." He smirked. "Well, after a banker named My Little Pony beat you up, I had my doubts." She snarled at him, and then all three of them looked down at their captured foe. He was a handsome young man, somewhat thin but clearly used to physical activity. His clothes were dark and purely made for function. If he was a thief or an assassin, he was definitely dressed for the job. The door of the study flew open, and Sir Byron stood there, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Grand Duke, what's going on in here? I heard a commotion." Gawain smirked. Curious, when My Little Pony was here, Byron didn't notice. But this young man made quite the commotion. He spoke aloud. "No, Sir Byron. Amber caught a thief is all." Sir Byron looked down at the incapacitated man. "Really? Amber did?" Amber glared at the knight. "Hey, why is everyone so surprised?" Gawain held up his hand. "You may return to your post, Sir Byron. If the trend continues, then we may have several more visitors in the night." Sir Byron furrowed his brow, clearly perturbed by the idea that there would be more visitors. But he knew how to be discreet, so the knight nodded his head. "Very well, my lord." Once Sir Byron had departed, Gawain turned back to Amber. "How did you capture him?" Amber smirked down at her defeated foe and puffed out her chest proudly. "Oh, this guy could have beaten me if he wanted to. But he tried to show off, tried to use shadow moves on me, and that's my area of expertise. This fellow was in a stupid position and went into the shadow mode with a flash. However, I saw him clearly and he wanted to sneak beside me while waving a small knife. I pretended as though I didn't see him then when he was close enough." Amber kicked in the air, her foot striking the desk. A vase wobbled and fell off of the table. Amber yelped and quickly grabbed it before it shattered. She giggled and set it back where it had been before. Rebecca sighed. She squatted down over the stunned intruder. "Can he wake?" Gawain shrugged. He murmured quietly, "A master rogue would feign death. Let's see how this one acts." The body of the trespasser twitched. He rolled his head and opened his eyes. His muscles tensed when he saw Gawain like a trapped turkey. Fear overtook his face and the man conspicuously bit down. Gawain and Rebecca started. "Does he have poison in his mouth? Some sort of suicide pill?" Amber's sing-songy giggle changed the tone of the evening in just a moment. "Looking for this?" She held up a tiny green bottle in her hand. The rogue flushed, embarrassed that his means of escape had been removed from him. But he didn't say anything. Rebecca cleared her throat. "What is your name?" The man stared blankly out. "Why are you here?" Still nothing. "Who sent you?" The man remained as quiet as the grave, not even looking at Rebecca or Gawain. Amber stashed the poison in her pocket. "Maybe he's deaf," Gawain snorted. "We won't fall for that trick." He knelt over the thief, who involuntarily recoiled from him. This man could tell where the real authority was. Amber drew out her wickedly sharp dagger. "I guess we just start torturing him." Rebecca and Gawain looked over at Amber, surprised. She blinked back at them awkwardly. "What? I don't go around torturing people. But I did see some pretty inventive techniques when I was robbing the dungeons." Rebecca blinked, baffled. "Wait, what did you steal from the dungeon?" Amber grinned. "Even the Viscountess herself doesn't know the secret treasures that your jailers pilfer from their inmates. Oh, they stash stuff away all the time. That's when I take them. No thief will report himself when another thief steals from him." Rebecca was about to retort, but Gawain cut in. "There's no use torturing him. He's a shadow guard, the cream of the crop. They're trained to resist torture." And as he was talking, he locked eyes with the young man. 700 years ago, the Royal Shadow Guard was only a personal bodyguard, and the most they would do was gather information from dangerous places. It's a shame that now they're reduced to common thieves. The captured Shadow Guard looked at Gawain in shock, and Gawain continued before the former spoke. "You want to ask me how I managed to identify you?" The Shadow Guard nodded. Gawain grinned. "I trained the first batch of Shadow Guards." Amber slid her dagger back into its sheath and fixed Gawain with an astonished expression. "You trained the rogues?" You, a knight? Gawain shrugged. I didn't teach them stealth, but I did instruct them on swordplay and how to maintain their stamina. Amber guffawed. Why should a rogue need to know swordplay? Gawain gestured at the man on the floor. For when they are caught. Looking down at the shadow guard, Amber sneered. Well, if they've been caught, they've failed. Gawain shook his head. Not in the capital. For the shadow guard being exposed is only part of the mission. Yet this one here doesn't seem to have completed the course as well. Either that or they train rogues much differently in the modern era. The shadow guard averted his eyes. Gawain pointed at him. There it is. Just as I suspected. 700 years may have changed much, but the foundations remain the same. He walked over to his desk and set the bloody dagger upon it. King Francis Moen sent you here, is that right? He looked over his shoulder. The young man's body was tense and he seemed to be scanning the room. Don't think about it. You were already defeated by a rogue. That woman by you right now is the most dexterous thrower of fireballs in Anzú. Rebecca blushed. And as for me, Gawain picked up a chair and placed it by the young man. He sat in it. I trained the men who 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 trained you. He left out several hundred generations, but he presumed his message was clear. I suspect the king didn't send you here to assassinate me. More than half of the capital knows I'm here, so why risk the scandal? So you must be here to spy on me, is that so? The young man's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Frankly, he should have cautioned you to stay farther away. Are you being overconfident, or did you not follow the instructions? The man's gaze darted up to Gawain. Insult my mission, and I will kill you. Gawain leaned forward. So you can speak. Good. Insecure about your post, I see. Your life has been comfortable. How has the Shadow Guard come to this? The Royal Shadow Guards are meant to protect the king, the country, and the land. If you were captured by the enemies on the battlefield, I would have respected you for your courage. But you are here in my house. Are you suggesting that I am a traitor who wants to tear the country apart by saying that I am insulting your mission? Or are you saying that capturing you is an insult to Anzú? Are you saying that the people of Anzú are now against the pioneer who built the country? The young shadow guard deflated, as if Gawain's stern reprimand had snapped something within him. Gawain leaned back. I see. Times are difficult. Don't worry, I'm not so petty as to punish you when you did not choose your mission, nor did you choose the sorry state of your order. Gawain stood and went to the window. You can go now. Amber and Rebecca's heads snapped over to look at Gawain. Both of their mouths hung open. The guard recoiled in surprise. What? You want me to go? Gawain nodded. I said you can leave. Do you want me to throw you out the window? The young shadow guard shook his head. He got to his feet slowly. Are you sure? Gawain laughed. Of course, I can't kill a man of King Francis's retinue, nor do I intend to bring you to the Silver Castle with the whole city watching, even though the prospect is tempting. Rebecca closed her mouth and then moved to speak, but a stern glance from Gawain slew the words before they could venture from her throat. The shadow guard moved to the window slowly. He opened it cautiously. He looked back at Gawain suspiciously. Gawain nodded. I don't intend to tell anyone about your little adventure. It's up to you how you want to update His Majesty about the matter. The guard bowed. Thank you for your mercy. After saying those words, the shadow guard vanished in a cloud of darkness. Gawain pursed his lips. Always the window. He closed the window and latched it. Rebecca rushed forward. Lord Ancestor, are you really going to let him off so easily? Gawain nodded. Of course. Rebecca shook her head, still baffled. But the king sent an agent to spy on us. Shouldn't the culprit be punished? Gawain turned to his descendant. Do you play chess? He walked back to his desk and stashed away the box that was in the secret compartment. Rebecca followed, still clearly baffled. No, Aunt Heidi tried to teach me, but I never had the patience for it. Gawain chuckled. Well, in chess as in politics, you don't play for the move you're making. You play for the move after your next move. You have to be far-sighted in order to get what you want. It's nothing to let a small pawn like our young interloper go, and there might even be potential benefits. Rebecca cocked her head. Potential benefits? In the corner, Amber started giggling, figuring out Gawain's train of thought. Gawain nodded at the thief. He needs to report to the king. There are only two paths he can take. Either he tells the truth and King Francis is stressed and upset, or he lies and now the king has a disloyal shadow guard. He turned around and looked at the moonless night sky as he was speaking. As the old saying goes, relative loyalty is the same as no loyalty at all. Gawain stared out the window of his study over the city of St. Soniel. Night-time didn't fall on a city quite as heavily as it did in the forest, or even back in Tanzan town. Back there, the blackness was oppressive. Here, however, various flickering street lamps, the lights in homes and apartments, and even a general magical glow held the darkness at bay. The city itself was like a star, defiantly shining in spite of the blackness surrounding her. Gawain shook his head, bringing himself back to the room where he stood with Rebecca and Amber looking on. "We should not antagonize the king, Rebecca, but we should be wary of him. Remember, his ancestors are of the Second Dynasty. Our prosperity and my very existence reminds them of the weak foundation of his claim to the throne." Rebecca nodded, though Gawain wasn't quite sure if she understood. He snapped his fingers toward Amber. "Amber!" Amber's ears perked up. Then she sighed. I know, back to keeping a lookout." She took a sluggish step toward the window, but Gawain shook his head. "No, I was going to say you can stay, but if you're bored, feel free to retire to your chambers. After all, you must be tired after defeating a shadow guard." Amber put her hands on her hips. Whoa, stop being nice to me. It's unnerving." She hopped away from the door and sat on Gawain's desk chair, putting her feet up on the table. "I'm not leaving. I'm curious as to what's next in your royal drama. Did I hear someone say inheritance earlier?" Her eyes glittered. Gawain shook his head, ignoring her. He reached into his coat. "Rebecca, over here." His descendant dutifully followed him to the desk, where he set the large platinum disc. As Gawain stared at the disc, memories of Gawain Cecil flowed into his brain involuntarily, along with the sound of battle. The sword of the founder blazed in his hands, a dark red fire stronger than ever. He swung at an oily beast and cleaved the monster in half. Another beast rushed toward him. This creature stood on two legs, but was hunched over and had a mouth large enough to swallow a grown man in a single bite. Gawain roared and rushed forward at the beast. It swiped its razor-sharp claws at him. Gawain deflected the beast's swipe as if it were a mere person with many swords. He then pressed his attack, lunging toward it. He swung his blade down upon the monster's hide. Yet even the sword of the founder bounced off the monster's skin as if it was a toothpick trying to break through plate armor. Gawain leapt back. The beast looked at him with its dull black eyes. A long forked tongue licked its grotesque lips. Gawain smiled and charged forward. The beast lashed at him, swinging its massive claws. Gawain dodged the first strike, then the second, then he rushed toward its mouth. The beast opened its jaws, revealing rows of bloody teeth. The pioneer shouted at the top of his lungs as he reached his arm into the beast's mouth, driving the sword of the founders through its head. The beast shrieked as the blade penetrated its hard palate and speared its brain. Gawain felt hot blood washing over his sword arm, but the beast still thrashed and opened its mouth, ready to bring down the full force of its bite. Gawain grunted and twisted his arm, spinning the blade in place. The beast went limp. Gawain sighed and pulled the blade home. The body fell down dead, before dissolving into magical residue. He stepped backward and took a look around the battlefield. Wagons were overturned and many burned. His soldiers rushed to and fro. The ground was littered with bodies of his valiant warriors, mixed with peasants alike. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see a knight standing by him, wearing armor gilded in silver decorations. However, those ornamentations were obscured by the dark green monster blood covering him. The knight removed his helmet. A billow of steam followed as he removed his headgear, revealing a sweaty yet handsome face. The good-looking man smiled. "The day is ours, Gawain." Gawain nodded. He looked across the devastation. "But at what cost, Charlie?" A few armored soldiers strode up to the pair of them. "The assets are secure." Charlie the First nodded. He moved to follow his men, but Gawain stopped by grabbing his armored elbow. We're too conspicuous. We can't keep bringing treasure through these mountains, not without risking more lives. Charlie nodded. He turned to his guards. Leave us. The vision faded. Gawain found himself speaking the story to Rebecca and Amber. We were transporting treasure from Gondolia to the north. It would help us establish a new kingdom, what would become Anzu. Yet, the more treasure we brought, the more we attracted the attention of monsters. Rebecca cocked her head. So, what did you do? Gawain stared at the platinum disc, eyes glazed over with thought. Charlie and I locked it away in a secret fort near the southern border. We created a powerful seal to protect it. Amber drummed her fingers on the table. She was pretending to listen casually, but clearly the idea of ancient treasure had set her heart aflutter. So why didn't you go back for it? Gawain shrugged. The monsters did not simply stay within the boundaries of Gondolia. No, they infested the Dark Mountains as well. There was no going back without an army, and in those days we needed every blade we could spare. Besides, we soon established a prosperous capital here. Therefore, we did not need that lost wealth anymore. Rebecca looked at the round platinum plate. But they haven't been forgotten completely. Gawain nodded. That's right. Charlie and I made an agreement. The two families would keep this secret and pass it down to our descendants. The Cecil and Moen clans would know about it, and we would take the treasures out when the Dark Wave ended and the new kingdom needed this wealth. Charlie loved the idea of a family secret passed down generation after generation. Amber snorted. Did you two make that decision because the both of you were drunk? Gawain nodded. You could say so. Rebecca tapped at the desk thoughtfully. But if that was the plan, how come I have never heard of it? Gawain shrugged. I died too soon. I wasn't able to tell my descendants. However, Charlie must have done so. Rebecca gasped. Wait, but the king! The bastard war! Gawain nodded. That's right, the current line is illegitimate. So if that's the case, I doubt that the current royals know about this treasure, especially now that we've found this key undisturbed. Rebecca reached toward the key and then stopped, as if afraid that the metal disc would bite her. Can we use it freely? Gawain chuckled. He strode across the room back to the window. Of course! Who else but you have a right to this treasure? After all, it's not like Charlie will be resurrected like me. Rebecca's eyes darted over to Amber. Amber held up her hands. What? I'm not about to rob another grave. Not after all the trouble this dead guy has gotten us into. Then her eyes widened. Wait! Amber hopped to her feet and backed away from Rebecca and Gawain. This is a family secret. I'm not supposed to know about this. Are you going to kill me? Gawain laughed. He shook his head in exasperation. After all this time, do you think I'd want to kill you now? Amber stuttered. But you let an outsider listen to a family secret. Gawain picked up the round plate from the desk and held it up. I trust you, Amber, and I know you're smart. This device can only be activated by the blood of Clan Moen or Clan Cecil. We don't know if Clan Moen's blood will work, considering the line is illegitimate, so you can't steal it. The only way of getting a part of this treasure is to earn it. Amber's mouth dropped. She shook her head, quickly regained her composure, and held herself up to her full height. Then I hereby pledge myself to you, Grand Duke Gawain Cecil. I, Amber, will be loyal to the best of my ability. But why talk about treasure and money now when so much is at stake? Gawain smirked, seeing through her false nobility. Well, then we will not talk about money. Amber flinched, annoyed that her double bluff had been doubly bluffed. Good. Even though she had an angle to her, Gawain was impressed that Amber could even feign some sort of loyalty. There were no other visitors that night, though, just to be careful, Gawain set a line of nails on the windowsill. The next day, Gawain assembled his retinue. After Betty made them a hearty breakfast, they set off on foot toward the Silver Castle. A messenger from the king arrived first, ready to clear their way. They strode before Gawain and his companions, proclaiming them in a voice amplified by magic. Make way for Gawain Cecil, the pioneer! The Grand Duke is meeting the king at the Silver Castle! While they walked through the streets with their clan's banners held high over their heads, dozens of passers-by watched them go. People gasped and whispered, It's Gawain Cecil, back from the dead! He looks good, better than I look some days, and I've never been killed by monsters. Is this the end of the world? He's clearly just an imposter. Guards held the crowd back to make sure Gawain and the others had a clear way through the busy morning streets. Rebecca looked at Gawain to see if he reacted to any of this gossip. But her ancestor didn't. He kept his gaze fixed forward. It seemed like Prince Edmund had passed Gawain's message to his father well. Francis II had put on a good show to the outsiders. Gawain smiled to himself. The king's reaction will tell us how the snooping shadow guard reported our encounter last night. Though it wasn't a long journey to the Silver Castle, perhaps half a mile. The opulence of this procession made it feel like 5 miles. By the time they got to the castle, Amber and Rebecca and even Sir Byron looked a little worn out. Gawain adjusted his clothes, made sure that nothing was askew on his person, and placed his hand upon the sword of the founder. He turned to his friends. "Come now, let's meet a king." With that he strode forward and the gates flew open. Gawain stopped outside the Silver Castle, right within the walls. Behind him, nobles watched with eager anticipation, each of them trying to sneak a glimpse of the Grand Duke. Evidently, word had travelled amongst aristocratic circles like wildfire. The poor carried on with their day. Merchants and the average citizenry glanced over but possessed little vested interest. The nobility, with all the time in the world, flocked outside the Silver Castle's tall walls. Advisers and the king's hand filed into the castle by means of a grand procession. Gawain followed in after as the gates shut close. The nobles outside murmured to themselves. The Grand Duchess of the North, Victoria Wilder, arrived 3 days ago. The Grand Duke of the West, Franklin Baldwin, and the Grand Duke of the East, Silas Lowland, arrived an hour ago. They stared up at the glossy silver exterior of the towering castle, looking for any hints. What could the Grand Dukes be gathered here for? Is it a banquet? A secret discussion? Might they be plotting an assassination? Enough of this! Are we not forgetting the most important guest of all, the supposed Duke of 7 centuries ago? What in the heavens is happening down in the Cecil territory? The nobles chattered and gossiped uselessly. This was the only way they knew how to use their time. Inside the Silver Castle, aides and servants led Gawain into the Oak Hall. The layout of the castle had changed much over the years, as to be expected given its gargantuan size. The Oak Hall was an old room. Its existence could be traced back 700 years ago when the foundations of the Silver Castle had just been laid. The castle then did not look like it was covered in silver as it did now. In fact, it was called the Silver Castle because Charlie I could not come up with a better name. Being the oldest room in this castle, the Oak Hall had been imbued with magic by a powerful court druid 400 years ago to ensure that its main wooden structure could be preserved forever. Though in reality, the magic had to be recharged every 100 years or so. Although the size of the Oak Hall was only 1/3 the size of the meeting chamber, the old hall was the most extraordinary place in the castle. Only nobles who were counts or higher could enter, and only matters of utmost importance to the fate of the kingdom were to be discussed here in secret. A round oak table took up most of the hall. The king sat in the spot in the star chart which represented the crown. On his right-hand side sat the king's hand, Alfred Eden, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and brooding eyes. On the king's right-hand side sat the Grand Duchess of the North, Victoria Wilder. Further on the left and right sides, respectively, were the Grand Duke of the West, Franklin Baldwin, and the Grand Duke of the East, Silas Lowland. The royal advisers sat in another row of chairs behind the king. Rebecca stayed nervously beside Gawain as they took their seats. Gawain worried about Amber, staying at 4 Crown Street. She could be emptying the mansion for all he knew. Gawain cast away the concerns, finding all eyes on him, specifically on his Grand Duke attire and sword of the founder by the waist. The remaining descendants of the Anzu pioneers filed in, filling Oak Hall with the most important figures in the land. Even if it went against aristocratic etiquette, they gawked and ogled at his entire being. Before Gawain could say something to lighten the mood, The old king across the table sat up, with the help of the king's hand. Francis II's blonde hair had turned grey long ago and was in the process of going pale white or falling out. Skin blotted with age spots sagged off his cheekbones. His eyes, which looked as though they were slowly sinking into their sockets, focused on Gawain Cecil. Lips on the verge of going purple cracked into a mischievous smile, the only shred of youth left in the old king. As the king stood up rigidly, everyone else joined in unison, lowering their heads in respect. The withering monarch spoke with a velvety, solemn voice. "The kingdom of Anzu is blessed by the gods that we have the honor of witnessing the pioneering hero who lived 700 years ago. We are grateful to you and your generation for your sacrifices and contributions. This land and everyone on this land will never forget the great founders. As the successor of the Moen clan, together with all the descendants of the pioneers, let us salute our ancient hero." The king took Alfred's hand and with excruciating effort bowed down deeply. Some seemed surprised by such a venerable act, but everyone quickly followed. A whole room of the most important people in Anzu bowed down before Gawain Cecil. The people of Anzu paid their respects to Gawain and the other pioneers at least once a year, but here he stood in the flesh, in the very hall he had helped build. Gawain's chuckles broke the silence. "The last time so many people bowed to me was when I was lying in that coffin." Francis II was the first to stand from his bow. He laughed as his eyes found Gawain. "It's only natural that the young should honor their elders." Gawain laughed too. "Although we have quite the age gap, your expression when you make excuses is exactly the same as Charlie's back in the day." Just like that, all the tension in the room disappeared. All of a sudden, it seemed like a long-lost companion rejoining a group of friends. The Grand Dukes and the other nobles were sharp enough to read the room, and lightened up as well. All except Victoria Wilder, the Grand Duchess of the North. She was in her 30s with a cold and aloof visage, silver fox fur draped elegantly down her shoulders, white silk gloves covered her slender hands, and Gawain guessed at least 4 maidservants helped braid her silver hair every morning. She had the aura of a queen of ice, and a beauty to match the title. She wore a permanent frown as she stared back at Gawain, completely undaunted by his presence. Gawain smiled at Victoria. "You have facial paralysis like your ancestor. I told him back then to marry a high-spirited southern girl to add some liveliness to that face of his, but he wouldn't listen." Only Victoria Wilder did not chuckle. Her face twitched. Gawain recalled what Dame Heidi had mentioned about Gawain Cecil and the upheaval 100 years ago. It was the Wilder clan that brought a bastard child into power and established the Second Dynasty. Gawain laid his eyes on Francis Moen. Could he be a descendant of that bastard child, even if he resembles the Charlie I knew? Gawain turned to the Grand Duke of the West and the Grand Duke of the East. With what information he had from his memories, he chatted a little about things regarding their ancestors. Franklin Baldwin and Silas Lowland seemed far more receptive and welcoming of Gawain. Finally, Gawain turned to look at the empty space between the king's hand and the Grand Duchess of the North. There was no chair in that spot. Originally, that was Cecil's spot. It had been removed because of Gawain Cecil, reducing the number of Grand Dukes from 4 to 3. From what Rebecca and Heidi said, a group of nobles directly subordinate to the royal family became the collective rulers of the south, and the Cecil clan was pushed to the far edge of the continent. Gawain looked away. Now was not the time to be bringing up a seat at the table. He had the audience of the current king now, and there were grave matters to discuss. Gawain took a deep breath. He felt the others quiet, hanging on to his gestures and expressions. He felt he could command the room even without his words. Thanks to the aristocrat's tact, the air grew as tense as he willed it. He looked to Francis II. "It's time we get to the reason why I am here. My descendant, the Viscountess Rebecca Cecil, will now detail the disaster that occurred south of the kingdom, the disaster that may have destroyed what little the Cecil clan had left." Rebecca quivered at the mention of her name. Never once did she imagine she'd be sitting in the oak hall of the Silver Castle, in the presence of the king himself, the 3 Grand Duke, and the kingdom's most influential figures. Fleeing the woods and fighting wolves had been enough, but seeing her 700-year-old ancestor chat casually with these preeminent figures made her dizzy. So dizzy, she nearly forgot she had come with Gawain with something gravely important to say. Though doubt sometimes suffocated her like a wet blanket, she was still the representative of the Cecil clan. And on behalf of her people, she willed herself to speak. Her words came out as a stammer at first, but Gawain's nod encouraged her to continue. She detailed the monsters 3 meters tall and made of mud. She explained the evacuation of the people. She mentioned the writings of a rogue mage about an experiment gone wrong due to red spots in the sun. She talked about the nightmare that occurred, each sentence emboldening the next. Everyone listened attentively. Most of them already knew of the incident, but only rumours. Gawain had asked for these rumours to be spread, even if the main topic across most taverns surrounded his resurrection. The king had detailed reports from nobles in the south, with writing from the likes of Viscount Andrew, but none of this compared to a direct account from someone present in the incident. Rebecca went on to link the disaster to the events of the Dark Wave 700 years ago. She mentioned the mysterious appearance of the dragon, too, that obliterated the Cecil territory beyond repair. Gawain studied the faces of the king and the nobility. They had probably come to verify his untimely resurrection, only to discover that the kingdom may be in peril. Their expressions darkened the more Rebecca spoke about the grave threat. Her nerves gone, Rebecca clenched her fists as she gave her final appeal. Now, most of the Cecil territory has become scorched earth. We all know the dragon's flame contains magic, and the lands that it has scorched will not be able to grow food for several years at least. My people had no choice but to seek shelter with Viscount Andrew. She looked to the king with a veneration and resolve that impressed even Gawain. Your Majesty and all the lords present, although the Cecil territory is small, I believe this disaster is just the beginning. We may not know why the dragon appeared, but the monsters present a real disaster. These are the same monsters that appeared 700 years ago and led to the fall of the Gondolian Empire. My ancestor has experienced it all firsthand. Gawain nodded. Francis II leaned in to whisper with the king's hand and the Grand Duke of the North. Several others also lowered their heads in discussion. Were it not for Rebecca and Heidi's efforts and Gawain's presence, a report such as this would have only drawn ridicule from the lords. Still, even in the quiet discussion, Gawain found it hard to decipher how these nobles truly felt about the incident. Peace was had for several generations now, and Gawain had seen firsthand how peace turned even the strongest soldiers complacent. The Grand Duke of the West, Franklin Baldwin, rose from his chair, revealing a thin, wiry frame. Grand Duke Cecil, I believe that your descendant speaks honestly, but still it stretches my credulity that these monsters are the same as the ones from the Dark Wave 700 years ago. Gawain's face grew dour. I dealt with those monsters every day and night for 20 years before my death. I would recognize them even if they were ash. I fought against them then, and I fought against them 2 months ago. If they did not disintegrate upon their death, I would have dragged their bodies directly into this sacred hall. If there is a way to have someone safely enter the territory to verify my descendants' words, I will gladly escort them. Franklin Baldwin and Silas Lowland, Grand Duke of the East, shared a look. Gawain crossed his arms. If you reckon the Cecil clan deliberately exaggerated the truth in exchange for your sympathy, in some desperate vie for power, you may say so. Grand Duke Baldwin waved his hands. No, we don't think of it that way. It's just a matter of verifying the truth. If it is connected to the Dark Wave, the magnitude of this is on a scale bigger than what any single human kingdom can face alone. Rebecca shot up. They are already at our doors. Her ire silenced the room filled with nobles. Gawain nodded, veiling his own frustration. Your Majesty, I understand the instinct for skepticism. After all, the cost of war is enormous. I spoke of the lack of evidence, but I brought these in hopes to sate your appetite for the truth. Gawain nodded to a butler who lugged in a leather bag. Gawain lifted the bag with ease and emptied the contents onto the table, revealing an assortment of swords and spears. These are weapons and equipment used by our soldiers in the south. Though the bodies of those monsters cannot be preserved, our weapons inevitably receive elemental contamination when fighting them. The corrosive substance left on those weapons should provide you with something to take reference from. I believe that even the most brilliant royal scholars will not be able to find any other samples that match these corrosive substances. The Grand Duke's and King's hand leaned in for a closer look. The sleek metal surface had been corroded into the texture of rotten wood. It seemed that even a single parry could shatter the blade. Until about half a month ago, these pieces of steel were still disintegrating. Unless the historians of the last 700 years have been lazy, you will find records of this corrosion as well. Francis II nodded with a sigh. There is. A silence fell across Oakhall. The other lords looked at each other, unsure if the king's words meant a confirmation of the monstrous danger. An icy voice broke the silence. Do you know where the dragon went? Gawain turned his head to Grand Duke Victoria Wilder, her gaze still just as chilling. The Cecil clan Viscountess tells a story without many narrative holes, all except the appearance of this dragon, a dragon that has conveniently obliterated all evidence. Rebecca clenched her fists. We don't know why the dragon came, but it appeared. We all saw it. Gawain lowered his head. Even as someone who had lived 700 years ago, he had never seen or faced a dragon, at least as far as he could remember. Victoria Wilder sat forward and clasped her hands together. It's quite peculiar, however, that a rumour spread 3 months ago about a dragon in my territory. Someone claimed to have seen a dragon flying from the icy mountains up north, but there were no other witnesses. The one who started the rumour was labelled a drunk, mistaking a snowstorm for a dragon. Gawain took a step forward. The northern mountains must be investigated. Francis II nodded slowly. Grand Duke Cecil is right. The monsters must be investigated too. We need to know if they've appeared in other parts of the kingdom, or if there have been any unusual surges of magical power. Rebecca could not help but speak up again. But investigating alone is not enough, Your Majesty. We must also prepare for battle. Those monsters will appear without warning. If we don't make preparations, we won't be able to defend in time. We need soldiers, not investigators. Grand Duke Silas Lowland of the East shot a disapproving look at Rebecca. Are we supposed to prepare every soldier across the kingdom to wait for these monsters, even if they may not even exist? Rebecca shot a daring look back at the Grand Duke. Yes, it'd be great if we could do that. Grand Duke Silas scoffed. That would be impossible. We can't just mobilize all the soldiers in the country on the accounts of a disgraced clan. The local aristocrats will rebel, and it would damage the royal family's status. The Duke of the East maintained a soldierly demeanour. There is also the threat of the Typhon Empire from the east. Their king is a ravenous wolf. They have been biting chunks off of my territory for some time already. Gawain cursed under his breath. When the Gondolian Empire fell, pioneers led survivors north, south, east, and west, establishing separate kingdoms in each direction. The Typhon Empire was located east of the Anzu Kingdom. With large plots of fertile land and bountiful mines, the Typhon Empire was currently the most powerful of the 4 kingdoms. Gawain could only imagine the strife along the border between Anzu and Typhon. Peace was mere words on paper. If an all-out war was to break out, even the Anzu Kingdom's alliance with the tribal kingdom of Ogari may not be able to change a tragic outcome. Gawain knew from a single look that someone like Silas Lowland would never divert military power away from the Typhon soldiers right along the border. Especially not for monsters that dwelled for the last 700 years in children's tales and the songs of bards. The council's response was exactly what Gawain expected. The king and the nobles were unsettled by the news from the south, as well as their resurrected ancient's warning. But panic would not move them to any sort of decisive action. Gawain's eyes wandered from the Duke of the East to Grand Duchess Victoria Wilder, to the king's hand, to the king himself. Those who did not experience the dark wave firsthand cannot imagine what horror it means. He looked down at his evidence. Even now, as he looked at the corroded swords, he felt the weakness in his argument. Of course, Francis II did not immediately take the magically distorted weapons as evidence of an impending apocalypse. He could not shift his entire kingdom's priorities based on a few broken blades. Gawain clenched his jaw. He had experienced very little of this second dynasty, and already he knew it felt weak, like they feared marshalling their forces for anything other than absolutely necessary. Rebecca's eyes met Gawain's. Her expression said as plain as day, "Are they going to say anything?" He shook his head ever so slightly, signifying that she should wait. He then turned to the king and broke the silence. "That is our report. It is for your majesty to decide what action you will take in response." It was not the king, but the cool voice of Grand Duchess Victoria Wilder which answered his statement. "The council heeds your warning, Grand Duke Cecil. Once this meeting is adjourned, we will begin investigations into your claims at once." Investigation. Of course. I propose we now speak of the state of my clan, Clan Cecil. Every noble in every chair stiffened, as if they had all suddenly felt muscle cramps in the most sensitive places in their bodies. Gawain laughed again. He held up his hand in an amiable gesture. "Relax. I didn't hop out of my coffin to demand that you pay me for all the years I've been dead." No one laughed at his attempted quip. Gawain bit his lip. That joke couldn't have made a more audible thud. "Anyway, I know what happened 100 years ago. Marquis Grumman's disgraceful conduct. If I could wring that craven's neck, I would do so myself. But I wasn't there, so I have no intention of calling into question the legitimacy of your line. I want to speak of something of mine, something that belongs personally to me." King Francis II and the other nobles sitting there let out an involuntary sigh of relief. They clearly didn't expect Gawain to be so conciliatory to a younger generation. Yet this relief lasted for a brief moment before the next question floated through each of their minds. They looked at each other, suspiciously. What belongs personally to Gawain Cecil? Especially since he used to lay claim on everything. The only one who didn't seem perturbed was King Francis Moan. The youthful smirk on his weak lips returned. "Well, tell us, what does the man who founded this very kingdom still claim as his own?" Gawain placed his fingertips together. "Relax. Most of my things from when I lived have already been passed on to my heirs. Grumman squandered much of it, so what passed through that ingrate's hands cannot be recovered from. What I'm referring to is my right to develop new regions." The nobles and the advisers looked at each other, shocked. Gawain remembered what Dame Heidi had told him. Each of them knew the laws, and they were brought up studying the history of Gawain, Charlie I, and their fellow pioneers. Alfred Eden, the Hand of the King, cleared his throat. "Of course, we all know the right of the founder, but you must know, Grand Duke Cecil, those laws are basically only there as a memorial to your accomplishments, not to be revived at a moment's notice." Gawain nodded. "I am aware, yet I have been recognized not only by my descendants, other nobles, and even your highness's self as who I claim to be. Surely word of me reached you long before I passed through the gates of St. Soniel's." The king looked over at Eden, who nodded. "Indeed, word is spreading through the kingdom at quite an impressive rate. He's the talk of every town south of the plains of the Holy Spirit." Gawain cast a look at the Viscountess behind him and shot her a wink. She hid a grin. He had told her on the road that their continued spreading of the story would pay off. She didn't expect it to happen so quickly, but it was still gratifying to watch those in power react to the bribes and rumours they spread during the journey. Had they not done any groundwork, the king or his advisers might have rejected his founder's right immediately. But now he looked at them appraisingly. "You must admit it is a bit unorthodox, my Lord Gawain." Gawain nodded. "Yes, but remember the right of the founder was recognized not only by Anzu but by the other 3 major kingdoms too, as well as the Sylvan Empire of the elves in the south. Our sharp-eared neighbours can live for millennia, so they know how important a lifetime right is." He looked over at Rebecca. "We thought that having a practically immortal race witness the rites as permanent would be a helpful touch at the time. I certainly never suspected to be calling upon its longevity now." The king leaned over to Eden. and had a hushed conversation with Eden. Gawain couldn't hear what they were saying, but he read their lips. They were asking if the same elf queen who ruled back in Gawain's day was still queen. Gawain smiled. It was something he hadn't thought to ask. Then Francis spoke. "The elf queen is still the same one you met in your days of youth." Gawain nodded. "I'm happy that someone who I knew in the past is still alive and well." But internally his thoughts were far from happy. Since he came from a different world, it was easy to write off the strangeness of his grammar, how it didn't match the speech of his countrymen and descendants, as simply a product of his age. Yet the Queen might recognize the difference in his bearing, his personality. He vowed to himself that he would stay as far from the Queen as possible, since she might undo everything he was working for. If I recall correctly, they should still have a copy of the edict, written in their own language. "We can send for her word to confirm it?" The king and the hand murmured to each other. Victoria Wilder drummed her fingers on the chair, her brows knit together tightly. She was deep in thought. Gawain hoped they wouldn't call his bluff. The king stopped all side-talking by striking the floor with his staff. "Very well. Before we involve any elvish envoy, let us call a vote. Do we recognize the Grand Duke's claim on the right of the founder?" Each of the nobles sat back in their seats. It was just then Gawain noticed a tiny lever on each of the hands of their chairs. He nodded to himself. Even here, they value discretion in voting. One by one, council members clicked the levers on their chairs. As they did so, wooden panels on the opposite wall of the oak room slid to reveal a green tab. Gawain watched. The dial on the wall revealed 6 green tabs, then 7, then 8. Rebecca looked over at him, her eyes brimming with hope. Every single noble voted yes. Once all the green tabs were revealed, the king struck his staff upon the floor declaratively. "You have our support, Grand Duke Gawain." With an unusual amount of effort, the king stood and motioned toward the guards standing by the doors. "Bring forth the map." He collapsed down into his seat. After a moment, several stewards wearing gilded coats and feathered hats appeared, carrying a scroll that was at least as tall as amber. They painstakingly unrolled the map before the nobles. Gawain peered at the rivers and mountain ranges dotting the continent. It had been some time since his journey through space, but he could tell that his bird's eye view had given him a better sense of Anzu than most of the king's cartographers had. The king gestured to the map. "Well, my Lord Cecil, where do you intend to settle?" Gawain stood and strode over to the kingdom. He heard Grand Duchess Victoria scoff. "All the lands in our borders are claimed. Do you want to live in the trees with the elves?" She spoke with such practiced authority that Gawain couldn't tell if she was genuinely asking or if she was mocking him. Nevertheless, he surveyed the land upon the drawing. Gawain grabbed the sword of the founder by its hilt and withdrew it from its scabbard. The council gasped, seeing the ancient weapon drawn in this keep for the first time in generations. Gawain pointed at the map with his sword. The blade pointed at Saint-Soniel, then continued through the plains of the Holy Spirit, past verdant lands owned by local lords, past Tanzan town, all the way down south. The advisers furrowed their brows. The king whispered to Alfred Eden, "Does he mean to settle the wasteland of Gondolier?" But the point of the sword stopped just before it reached the Empire's ruin. Gawain looked up, meeting the king's gaze. "I'll start here." The sword of the founder pointed at a mountain range, which sat between the Typhon Empire and the wasteland of Gondolier, the Dark Mountains. A shockwave passed through the assembled nobles. In their wildest guesses, they would not have suspected that Gawain would lay claim to the Dark Mountain range. The first person to break the silence was the Grand Duke of the West, Franklin Baldwin. He sputtered with shock, his eyes bulging from his head. "Are you sure?" Gawain cocked his head at Baldwin. "Is anything wrong with it? Don't tell me someone owns the land there now." Grand Duke Baldwin blinked and blinked, as if he had to scare mosquitoes from his eyes, but his mouth made no noise. King Francis II shook his head. "What the Duke is trying to say is that the Dark Mountains are an inconvenient place for you to settle. Things have changed since your day." The frail king gestured at his hand. Alfred Eden nodded and spoke. The entire Dark Mountain range stretches from the south to the east. In the south, it goes into the Gondolian wasteland, a toxic desert, polluted by the Dark Wave. Things are not much better on its eastern side, where it stretches right up to Typhon's borders. Things between Anzu and Typhon are tense. The situation is delicate, and they might view new settlements as a provocation. Your people are tired, and I very much doubt they would enjoy being on the front lines of a war. Viscountess Rebecca spoke. That should be no huge problem. Those left survived monster attacks, so dealing with ornery neighbours will be the least of their troubles. The Grand Duchess Victoria Wilder spoke. True, but your ancestor may not be aware that our forebears have attempted to settle this area before. Gawain's heart skipped a beat. He was unaware of this. His eyes darted to Alfred Eden. The king's hand nodded slowly. It was a project of King Lysander III. He wished to purify the Gondolian wastelands. They established purification points where powerful mages, holy priests, and the strongest knights in the land worked to clear the land of its dark magic, toxic airs, and roaming monsters. But no matter how many protective and restorative spells they placed on the land, how many times they cut down roaming beasts, each and every one of these purification points fell, consumed by the rot. Gawain nodded thoughtfully. Remarkable. He looked up. Yet I shall succeed where Lysander III failed. You see, I'm not as adept at politics as you are. He gestured to the nobility in the room. But I fought these monsters at the height of their power. After a moment of hushed murmuring, the king nodded. Very well. If you wish to brave the Dark Mountains, then you have our leave to do so. You have been warned, and if you can make a home for your people there, so much the better. The king snapped his fingers and stood. The rest of the council rose as one. I'm afraid I must retire. I have a pressing business of the state. Gawain nodded respectfully. Rebecca followed suit. The king hobbled out of the room. When the king was gone, Alfred Eden resumed speaking. Well, now that we have your agenda established, I'm afraid there are some procedural matters of governance and nobility that your awakening has called into question. Several secretaries rushed forward, carrying scrolls after scrolls. Gawain sighed heavily. Rebecca looked toward him questioningly. He waved his hand. Much of politics will change the world. Most of it is tremendously tedious. Rebecca soon realized the truth of her ancestor's proclamation. The next few hours crawled by as Gawain and the king's trusted nobles discussed the state of nobility, now that Gawain was confirmed to have returned from the dead. Among other decisions was that Gawain's status as Grand Duke was confirmed, but he could not transfer this status to his descendants. After all, Clan Cecil was too diminished to warrant a Grand Duke's status. This was unfair, but it was consistent with the events following the Bastard War and Grumman's rebellion. After much discussion, Gawain and Rebecca got what they came for. An undisturbed country within a country. A place for the survivors of Clan Cecil's ruined territories. The king's hand also agreed to send 100 craftsmen and apprentices to help lay the groundwork for a successful fiefdom. Rebecca and Gawain left the meeting satisfied, albeit the younger of the two dragged her feet and groaned. Dear gods, Lord Ancestor, that was dreadful. Is every meeting that agonizing? Gawain chuckled and shrugged. In most worlds, politics is a fate I would not wish on our worst enemy. Rebecca shook her head slowly. I understand why now. At least we're finished now. Gawain gently took his descendant's arm. He smirked and shook his head. Rebecca's eyes swelled to the size of moons. No, we're not having more meetings, are we? Gawain's smile widened. Don't worry, no more meetings, but we're far from done with politics. Upon hearing a pair of distinguished footsteps, Gawain and Rebecca turned. A butler sauntered up to them. He bowed crisply. Viscountess, Grand Duke, if you will follow me to the Grand Hall. The butler turned in place, so smoothly that he appeared to be a puppet piloted by strings, rather than a person moving their body. As he strode away, Rebecca looked up at Gawain questioningly. Gawain held his arm forward. After you, Viscountess. She blushed and rushed to catch up with the butler. Gawain smiled to himself and followed at a leisurely pace. They climbed a grand staircase and passed portraits of kings, queens, princes, princesses, lords and ladies. As they walked down the hallway, Gawain couldn't help but marvel at how the art style differed from paintings of old on Earth. Some of the royalty were portrayed realistically, with neutral expressions, like historical figures that Gawain remembered from his previous lifetime. Others resembled caricatures, with exaggerated physical features. Some were more abstract, with one duchess being entirely made of light brushstrokes, as if her body was built from the mist. The butler led them to a massive doorway at the end of the hall. Just before entering, Gawain stopped. Rebecca watched his gaze and gasped. Hanging by the doors were twin portraits of Gawain himself as well as Charlie I. Gawain cocked his head. In his memories, he couldn't remember ever having sat for a portrait, and, in fact, the artist seemed to have missed a few details. Gawain's ears looked wrong. This was clearly a picture based on a previous picture, a likeness drawn from memory, not from life. 100 questions swirled in Gawain's mind. Who were you? Why was your body in good condition? What role have I played in your plans? A small cough brought Gawain's attention back to reality. He turned to see Rebecca waiting with the butler at the entrance. He shook his head, dispelling the doubts that still plagued him. For the moment, at least. Apologies. Please. He walked up to join them. The butler nodded. Welcome. To the grand feast hall. Rebecca gasped, and even Gawain couldn't suppress his awe at the sight before them. The grand feast hall certainly lived up to its name. The room could have fit a couple of small stadiums within it. Long tables stretched across the floor, piled high with steaming food. Whole pigs and roasted turkeys glazed in honey and fine sauces lay temptingly upon platters. There were cornucopias of fruit, strawberries and raspberries, all glistening with their barely contained sweetness. There were whole fishes, diced to perfection, resting on beds of fluffy rice, and salad so green that it seemed like the fresh lettuce and bright red tomatoes were still growing even as they sat there ready for consumption. Even in a world with modern technology and cooking shows, Gawain struggled to remember the last time he had seen a meal so decadent. The ceilings were as high as a cathedral's, and the whole affair was lit by a massive chandelier of glittering silver in the shape of a dragon. Its blue sapphire eyes seemed to gaze curiously at Gawain, even as a friendly fire blazed in its jaws and on the backs of its wings. Magical snow and glowing balls of light hovered above the dragon, clearly cast by mages to beautify the inside. In the center of the room, right underneath the dragon, was a bare part of the floor, clearly set for dancing. Though no one had started to dance there yet, a band had set up and begun to play entrancing and lively music. Gawain looked over at his descendant and suppressed a guffaw. Rebecca looked hypnotized by the glorious sight before them. Aunt Heidi never told me that they ate like this in court. Gawain put his hand on his descendant's shoulder. They don't generally. I suspect they pulled out all the stops for my benefit, though it is customary for a deal well done to be celebrated by a meal. I haven't seen a feast like this since I was 16 when my father hosted a banquet at Cecil Castle, but even then... She looked up with pleading eyes. May we? Gawain gestured forward. You're the Viscountess of Clan Cecil. Go ahead. Rebecca let out a tiny squeal and rushed to the plates. Gawain followed slowly. He was sure Dame Heidi would have been appalled by Rebecca's girlish glee. But Gawain didn't comment on it. They served themselves food and sat to the side, all the while observing the dancing and discussing nobles. After a moment, a teenage boy with his ruffled collar almost swallowing him approached Rebecca. Viscountess Cecil, may I have this dance? Rebecca paused for a second. She looked at Gawain. He gritted his teeth. May I, ancestor? Gawain looked from the ruffled boy back to his descendant. He didn't trust this lad. The kid was probably from a rival house or desired favor, or had some sort of ulterior motive. A gentle voice sounded from behind him. Overprotecting your child will hinder her from growing. Gawain turned to see Franklin Baldwin, Grand Duke of the West, alongside Grand Duchess Victoria Wilder. Gawain smiled. I see. He turned to Rebecca. Go if you wish, but remember not to hurl any fireballs. The boy shrunk even further into his ruffles. Rebecca grabbed his hand and skipped off. Gawain smirked. Good! That'll keep him from any underhanded moves. He turned his attention back to the Duke and Duchess. Thank you. I died young, so I don't have much experience with youths. Baldwin nodded. Even the greatest mage couldn't cast a spell to make a child easier to manage. At least the Viscountess seems to be enjoying herself. Gawain's eyes landed on the Duchess Victoria Wilder, and he found himself brimming with curiosity. Rather than speaking of my descendant, I have questions for you, Duchess Victoria. Nothing really fazed Victoria Wilder. As Grand Duchess of the North, she'd seen it all. A Grand Duke of 700 years ago wanting a word with her would have been strange a month ago, but now it was to be expected. Grand Duke Baldwin raised an eyebrow. Should I excuse myself? Gawain lifted a glass of red wine from the tray and turned around to look at Victoria. It doesn't matter. Victoria's eyes possessed no emotion. You want to talk about dragons? Gawain nodded, but Victoria's tone only grew more frigid. It's only a rumour, as I've said. It's been investigated thoroughly, and no one other than a drunkard saw any trace of a dragon in the northern cliffs. Gawain shook his head. I don't mean the incident from a month ago. I mean across all of history in the north. Since my death, how many rumours have there been about dragons in the north? Victoria furrowed her brows gently in concentration. Grand Duke Baldwin looked curiously back and forth between Gawain and Victoria. It seems stories of dragons are a specialty of the north. Victoria sipped her own glass of red wine. There have been the occasional tale of dragons. There are even tribal groups that worship the dragons. But these people call snowstorms the roar of dragons. Further north is the sacred dragon kingdom, where people call themselves descendants of dragons. It's only natural that the folks living in the mountains become influenced by their stories and legends. That said, the Wilder clan has not seen an actual dragon for 700 years. Gawain sighed, yet I laid my eyes upon one as the Cecil territory fell. Victoria's lips curved ever so slightly into a smile. I will inform you if there really is a dragon. Grand Duke Baldwin looked to Victoria. He proffered his arm to her. Now that is out of the way, shall we dance? Gawain stepped back with a smile and a small bow. Please go and enjoy yourselves. I'm afraid I don't know modern dance, and I'm sure talking to a 700-year-old fossil can get boring. I appreciate the hospitality from both of you. Victoria and Franklin shared a look and walked off. Gawain sighed with relief and retreated to his own thoughts. The rumours of a gigantic dragon in the north still seemed like an important clue. According to ancient history, the dragons left the land thousands of years ago, so long ago that there were no clear records about their appearance. They were deemed mythical for a reason, even to someone like Gawain Cecil. Gawain Gao, however, knew of dragons. He had dwelled in space since the beginning of the world's formation, watching life evolve. He organized his thoughts and memories of that time, of being without body, of being trapped as an observer in some celestial body, and he remembered dragons in the north of the continent. Whether it was a period of 1,000 or 10,000 years, dragons descended from the northern mountain range. All of them seemed to have a clear destination, burrowing into the deepest part of the earth only to resurface and disappear. Whatever mission they had underground, Gawain did not know. From Gawain's limited perspective as an observer from the sky, he had no true idea where the dragons came from beyond the north. But in the pit of his stomach, he had a feeling that the gigantic dragons would appear again. Gawain observed the banquet of nobles enjoying themselves, free of worry. Ignorance is bliss in every world, but not for Gawain. Knowledge was his curse, as Gawain possessed the knowledge of a Grand Duke from 700 years ago, the knowledge of an observer in the orbit of this world, and the knowledge of a man who died in a plane crash on Earth. Gawain and his people departed the capital on the third day. The help which the king had promised them would arrive on a later date. The rations could not be transported on land because half of it would be consumed by the people and horses. If the rations were to be transported by the river, they had to wait half a month for the water level of Dew River in the plains of the Holy Spirits to rise. It also took time to gather 100 craftsmen and apprentices. Rather than wait in the capital for all this to be sorted out, Gawain left with big plans in his mind. He had gotten the right to form new territory in the dark mountains, and he had a pile of documents to fill out to go along with it. Their horses were brought from the royal stables where they were pampered and groomed. They hopped on, all of them ready for an expedited return to Tanzan town. Gawain gestured to the others. "Come on!" They took their own sweet time on their way to the capital. But Gawain wished he could fly straight back. He envied the teleportation magic in fantasy novels. If only he could teleport directly back home. Although such magic existed in the continent of Loren, it was far less advanced than those described in stories. The magics used by different communities were basically about hitting someone with a fireball or throwing compressed sun energy in someone's face. Records of teleportation and space storage magic existed, but they were generally far-fetched theories. For instance, the first legendary elves were said to be able to teleport. Some people said that the dragon language magic, the origin of most magics in the world, had records about the ability to expand space. It was a pity that no one had ever seen it. On the other end, the Grand Duchess of the North, Victoria Wilder made her way back to the castle in the north, the Bitterwinter Castle. After all, the Grand Dukes safeguarding the 4 parts of the kingdom could not leave their territory for a long period of time. Once she arrived, she removed her robe, handed it to a servant, and headed into her study. Inside, a woman with black hair placed a cup of warm tea on her table. She stood behind Victoria and gently massaged her shoulders. The dark-haired woman spoke with a deep, reassuring voice. "You look spent," Victoria spoke in a low voice. "The rumors are true. The legendary Gawain Cecil has returned. He looks exactly like the statues. His Sword of the Founder is the same too. I used lie detection magic and everything he said was true." The woman behind Victoria caressed her neck. Highly skilled liars can hide from lie detection. Plus, even if the magic is effective, it may not work all the time. Victoria shook her head. "Margie, I still have my intuition." The woman named Margie sighed. "What do you intend to do?" Alone with Margie, Victoria let her emotions unravel. The most prominent of them was fatigue. The hero who revived didn't seem interested in interfering with the current politics. He came only for the permanent right to develop a new region. She frowned. "What I'm concerned about is his attitude towards the king. Initially, I thought that this pioneer would take the legitimacy of the lineage of the Moen clan seriously and confront the royal family about it. However, he openly acknowledged Francis II as the descendant of the founding king. I didn't expect this." Margie's hands stopped in their massage. "Perhaps they discussed it in private." Victoria nodded. "Perhaps. It may be even harder now to control the king." Margie faced Victoria. "Don't tell me you're going to—" Victoria cut her off. "No, I do not covet power. I only wish for Anzu to prosper forever." Margie frowned. "What are you going to do then?" Victoria looked up at the wall, where the emblem of the Wilder clan hung, next to 5 portraits. "I don't like what my father's generation did. They were brutes, all of them." One of the 5 portraits depicted the founding king, Charlie Thirst. The other 4 were the pioneer knights. Those portraits were the standard portraits in every noble family. Next to the portrait of the ancestor of the Wilder clan was the portrait of Gawain Cecil. That mighty man wore armor, held the sword of pioneers, and stared off in the distance as if those distant eyes could transcend time and space, peering out from the frame into the present. Victoria pointed at Gawain's portrait. "Take that portrait down. It isn't appropriate to hang it here anymore." Margie shot a look of concern. "Are you sure?" Victoria rubbed her temples, trying to excise a headache. "He said it himself, that he's not used to seeing himself hung on a wall. He is our ancestors' close friend, a living legend. It's only right that we listen to him." Margie nodded. She walked over to the wall and took the portrait down. As Victoria watched, she was reminded of something. "Oh, Margie, you're from the mountains, right?" "I am." Victoria stood. "What do you know about the dragons? What do you think of them?" Margie stood with her back facing Victoria. She remained silent for a while. Then she shook her head, turned around and smiled plainly at the Grand Duchess of the North. "Those are just ridiculous myths." Gawain, Cecil, Rebecca, Amber, Sir Byron and the soldiers returned to Tanzan town safely, bringing with them the documents signed by the king as well as the news regarding the royal palace's assistance. Viscount Andrew, who had waited at Tanzan town for nearly 3 months, felt that he had made the right decision. The kingdom-founding hero 700 years ago had not let him down. He was not merely a warrior like what he was worried about, but someone who could also fight in the dangerous battlefield that was politics. Gawain updated Viscount Andrew on everything, including the new territory in the Dark Mountains granted to him and all of the Cecils. In the Viscount's castle, the scrawny yet stern nobleman worried over the news. "Pardon my bluntness, Grand Duke Gawain, but the spot that you have chosen really isn't suitable. Although there is an abundance of land, it's too close to the Dark Mountains. With the lack of protection from civilization, the monsters in the mountains are great threats. Furthermore, during the fog month every year, unclean wind blows from the wastelands and passes through the mountains. The fit and healthy soldiers may remain unharmed, but the poor and powerless may not be able to withstand it." Gawain shrugged. The other choices were all roughly the same. Out of the spots surrounding the Dark Mountains, the one I've chosen is already the best. Unclean wind can be suppressed by medicine and magic. Once we get through the first year, we will be able to mine the ores from the mountains and stabilize the territory. Gawain, of course, concealed the fact that there were 700-year-old treasures buried within the mountains. Seeing how stubborn Gawain was, Viscount Andrew said no more. He left Gawain with a reminder. "Naturally, I will support you to the best of my abilities. But please also remember our very first deal." Gawain grinned. "Do not worry. If it will give you peace of mind, would you like to take a piece or two of these antiques I have on me as a deposit?" Rebecca, a room across, looked up. She recalled suggesting they pawn off Gawain's clothing as well. Before she could say anything, Dame Heidi smacked the back of her head. Though she had appeared pleased at seeing her niece returned safely from the capital, the austere mage had swiftly returned to her strict treatment of Rebecca. "Focus. Tell me more. When you were at the king's banquet, what else did you do?" Rebecca pouted. "I was mostly eating." Heidi let out a sigh. "Oh, my heavens!" Back in Viscount Andrew's study, the nobleman frantically waved his hands at Gawain. "No need, no need. I believe in the reputation of the Cecil clan and the promise of the nation-founding hero." Both of them looked out the window to Tanzan town and to what they could make of the Dark Mountains in the distance. "When do you intend to depart?" Gawain checked his wrist but remembered watches did not exist in this world. "As soon as possible. We'll leave once we've gathered the supplies. The aid promised by the king won't be here for another month, and I ought to let my residents settle down in their new home first. I have Sir Philip and Sir Byron purchasing necessary equipment and supplies to construct homes to start us off." Andrew could only sigh. "Godspeed, then. Godspeed. 1, 2, heave!" A team of workers and soldiers heaved yet another wooden pillar onto a wheeled platform hitched behind a Cecil wagon. The equipment and building materials piled up like mountains. Even Dame Heidi, who had always facilitated the management of the Cecil territory, and Sir Byron, an experienced knight of the Cecil clan, had no idea where to begin. Nobody knew what was needed to rebuild a territory from scratch. Only Gawain could provide some help in this aspect. During the great founding period 700 years ago, the forefathers of Anzu built their home from scratch. Gawain's memories were a valuable experience for everything that needed to be prepared during the founding period. No matter how the tools developed and transformed, the core problems of founding a territory in the wilderness were still the same: food, shelter, and hygiene. As for the problem of funding, Viscount Andrew had returned the Cecil clan their gold and silver. With the addition of the money stashed away by Sir Philip, there was just enough to gather some starting supplies. The refugees from the Cecil territory wandered around the town, buying goods and pushing carts, which caught the attention of the locals. The people of Cecil brought a substantial amount of business to the town of Tanzan. This mitigated much of the ire drawn by the refugees inhabiting a large number of shacks over the last 3 months. While Sir Philip and Sir Byron went around collecting supplies, Gawain tasked Heidi and Rebecca with counting the number of the Cecil residents. Get all the details, down to the name, age, gender, health and skills of each individual. Then group them into their families and at the same time make another list with just the carpenters, masons and blacksmiths. If possible, allocate everyone an identification number for ease of checking. Dame Heidi and Rebecca both frowned. They didn't know anything about forms and ID numbers and basic population registries. Upon seeing the perplexed looks on Heidi and Rebecca, Gawain felt even more confused himself than them. "You've never done it before? Then how did you count the population in the territory?" Rebecca replied innocently. "The area around the palace is under the charge of Aunt Heidi, and the few knights are in charge of their own delegated areas. We always only had a rough estimate of the number of men, women, elderly, and children. As for who are blacksmiths and carpenters, the people living there all know one another. We just ask around." Gawain looked as though he wanted to crawl back into his grave. Upon noticing the rapidly changing face of Gawain, Heidi immediately became nervous. "Lord Ancestor, did you and the founding king count the population at that time using the sort of form that you speak of?" Gawain quickly rummaged through the information in his mind, and a split of a moment later his face turned pale. "Of course not," he realized. "This is just the basic procedure on Earth. 700 years ago in this world, it was only more chaotic." Gawain closed his eyes and relived the Gondolian Empire's collapse. The lucky ones who survived the first wave of attacks were all people from the remote regions. That ancient empire had been a classic example of an imbalanced society. As the magic skills in this world depended on limited magic concentration spots, all the advanced technologies of the Gondolian Empire were accumulated around the strongest concentration of magic, the Azure Fount in the center of the mainland. As for the remote regions with weak concentrations of magic, they were unbelievably behind the times. When the Dark Wave caused the Azure Fount to explode, the most advanced portion of the population was wiped out at once. Eventually, when the pioneers led everyone out of their fate, what could be called advanced human civilization could be said to have been utterly destroyed. To put it bluntly, the Four Kingdoms were built by a group of illiterates led by a group of elementary students. All that said, in a world where extraordinary powers exist, a single person could equate the strength of 100. Therefore, it was possible for the Four Kingdoms to be established under the perseverance of pioneers who carried the new Anzu kingdom on their backs and rebuilt civilization. Gawain opened his eyes and let out an exasperated sigh. No matter how dire things had been to begin with, though, it's been 700 years. After 700 years, how was it that not a single improvement had been made? The survivors of Clan Cecil's lands made preparations to leave. Gawain gave orders and led the party along, but all the while his thoughts were consumed with how this world differed from his own, and why not much had changed in 700 years. After mulling it over, he was forced to concede that magic was to blame. In a world where the aristocracy had the power to reshape the world to their benefit, there was little reason to invent new technologies, or invest in those that might do so outside of their influence. In a world where frost arrows existed, who would think of inventing refrigerators and air conditioning? Yet even as this thought crossed his mind, he couldn't help but ponder how limited magic's use actually was. Frost arrows had only one purpose. They could not make ice cream for a hot summer's day, or preserve serums for modern vaccinations. At least, not yet. He couldn't voice this thought aloud without giving away his secret, but Gawain suspected that magic shouldn't be a hindrance to progress, but should enhance it. After all, it was just another way to harness energy. He stashed these thoughts away for later, as they highlighted problems he couldn't fix in the here and now. As they meandered through the crowd, Gawain continued to explain the need for conducting a census to Heidi and Rebecca. "If we are to run our lands in a way to benefit everyone, we need to know who that benefits." Dame Heidi nodded. "All that which you're saying is true, Lord Ancestor. However, the commoners will be suspicious if we are attempting to round up their information. They might think we want to conscript them into the army." Gawain gritted his teeth. Of course. Change was always difficult when it came from the top down. "Very well, then we shall simply ask for their names, and only have craftsmen and artisans supply more details." By the first day, they were able to start distributing the primitive forms. Some of the professional soldiers and knights, like Sir Byron and Sir Philip, needed to translate for the illiterate amongst them, but they were able to collect most of the knowledge they needed without notable resistance. No one had ever collected the statistics of the commoners, since the aristocrats didn't see them as having any value. The only role of the civilians was to be a free labor source that churned out agricultural products. Because no one recognized the value of a human, no one recognized the need to register population data. Yet as Gawain implemented this process, he was pleasantly surprised that Rebecca had a natural knack for this. She was personable and eager to help her people, so no matter how low or dirty the persons seemed, she happily rushed to their side to collect their data. Dame Heidi watched her niece go about with suspicion. She remarked upon this to Gawain. She seems to have taken a shine to this decree. Gawain smirked. Rebecca's a bit rough around the edges in many ways, but she wants the best for those beneath her. Like her decree which allowed serfs to earn freedom through military service, others of your caste might do well to learn from her. Heidi stroked her chin thoughtfully. Upsetting Anzu's status quo was anathema to her worldview, yet she seemed amenable to the prospect, while the clan had few other options. Once the census had been completed, and all of the nearly 900 people were accounted for, Gawain decided to divide them into 2 teams for the journey into the mountains. The first was the advance party. Consisting of himself, Rebecca and Heidi as its leaders, the party included half of Sir Byron's soldiers and militia, as well as key craftsmen and 100 labourers. They were to set up a temporary camp at their destination, identify water sources and other conditions, and lay out precautionary measures against wild animal attacks. The majority of the commoners would then follow, escorted by Sir Philip, excepting those too old and sick to travel. Viscount Andrew had agreed to let them stay until they were fit enough to make the trek without issue. No amount of preparation was enough to break into barren land, but the first step to doing so was always necessary. After as much planning and delegating as they could do, Gawain and his party finally left Tanzantown and advanced south towards the Dark Mountains. Once again, Gawain found himself wishing he had access to one of the tamed griffins he had heard about in the capital, but there was no way they could have enough flying beasts to carry all 800 of them to their destination, even taking multiple trips. They marched along the flatter banks of the tributaries of the White River, with the knights and feudal lords in front to lead the way. The soldiers flanked both sides of the party as guards, and the skilled craftsmen, along with their supplies and tools, led their carts and donkeys along in the middle, well protected. On horseback, Heidi looked back at the not-quite-large party. It seems we've become pioneers like you were back in the day. Gawain chuckled at the profound insight. Pioneering knows no age, Heidi. Whether then or now, we're all pioneers. Heidi grimaced. Gawain suspected she was recalling how difficult she had found travelling through one small forest. The prospect of establishing a new seat of power in the Dark Mountains was far worse. But when you and Charlie the First went pioneering 700 years ago, Gawain cut her off. We left with fewer supplies and in far more dangerous conditions. Heidi nodded, still looking pretty unsure of herself, which was a strange look for such an austere woman. Gawain galloped his horse up to hers and playfully elbowed her on the arm. She flinched. Be confident. Every step into the unknown is a great journey. We will not only be building a new home, we might even be establishing a new era. Heidi stared at Gawain blankly, then nodded. She wasn't sure what Gawain meant by establishing a new era, but his words were filled with such confidence that they surely foreshadowed greatness just around the corner. Beside them, Amber applauded. Gawain scoffed. The half-elf almost seemed to be genuinely impressed. Gawain didn't take that at face value, though. Since she swore that he was the boss, she had seldom left his side. Loyalty may be temporary with this rogue, but she didn't pursue anything half-heartedly. The closer they got to the Dark Mountains, the more desolate the landscape became. Verdant green hills became brown and desolate. Trees seemed to slump in defeat, their leaves only dangling onto stems from sheer force of will. Even the White River appeared to flow cautiously, as if a single drop of water could bring about the next dark wave. As they galloped, something caught Amber's eye. The half-elf leaped from her horse and darted over to the ground. Gawain, Heidi, and Rebecca craned their necks to see what she was looking at. After a moment, Amber turned and held up something that glinted in the light, a metal spoon. "Look! People must have lived here!" Heidi nodded. Aye, they did. Before the dark wave, there were many towns around here, but the blight of monsters drove them to ruin. Don't expect to find anything valuable. Rebecca gulped. So there'll be more monsters here. Dame Heidi's eyes scanned the horizon. They should have all been driven back to the Gondolian wasteland, but after their resurgence in our homeland, I'd say anything is possible. The group continued onward, still following the river, albeit more cautiously than they had been before. It turned out that spoon would be the last trace of humanity they saw during this rugged expanse on the way to the mountains. According to Heidi, after monsters retreated into the wastes of Gondolia, humanity simply hadn't bothered resettling the area. They saw it as a bad idea. They travelled along the river for 3 days, and each night they stopped to make camp. Soldiers kept watch and were assailed by eerie noises in the night. Yet nothing manifested to harm the travellers. On one such night, a ghostly howling echoed through the twisted trees. Rebecca trembled. She turned to Gawain. "Monsters?" He shook his head. Amber chuckled. "Ghosts, more likely. Civilians whose names have been forgotten by time. They howl just to be remembered." Rebecca glared at Amber. "I'll ask you to leave your elfin mysticism where it belongs." Amber shrugged. "Just a theory. But if you'd rather it be monsters..." Whatever the reason, eventually the party would always move on. Eventually, on the 3rd day, they stopped at a clearing. This clearing lay closely adjacent to the Dark Mountains. In fact, it was nestled between the river and the mountains, a narrow plain. Here, the tributaries of the White River relaxed. Their speed slowed as they flowed gently through the northern side of the Dark Mountains and straight into the Typhon Empire. Upwards in the southern direction lay the grand yet terrific sight of the Dark Mountains themselves. Steep slopes and jagged peaks extended up into swirling grey clouds. While the others unpacked, Gawain climbed a large boulder and surveyed the surrounding scenery. Heidi shouted up to him. After all, she had no intention of doing any climbing. "Ancestor, what do you see?" "There's a forest just south of here, black cedar and giant wood. That could be a valuable source of timber. In the east, the mountain juts out a little. There should be hematite deposits over there." Gawain slid down the boulder and landed next to his descendant. "The Dark Mountains are in fact a treasure trove of valuable minerals. We just need to know where to look, especially since the Mohans have given up on them." Gawain pointed toward the clearing. "Set up camp here and put up all the tents we brought. Lumberjacks should start gathering timber. Send each with a guard, just in case. Don't let them venture too deep into the forest. We don't know what animals lurk within." Rebecca and Amber strode up to them. Rebecca flinched. "There might be demons there too." Gawain laughed. "No demons, Viscountess. The effects of the dark wave have long since faded away. Amber, Rebecca, fetch Sir Byron, please. We're going to the mountains." Heidi paused for a moment. "Ancestor, where are you going?" Gawain smirked at the group. "I'm going to reclaim my inheritance." Gawain and the party of 3 set off. They left their horses behind with Heidi and the remainder of the expedition. Since they were going to be navigating treacherous terrain, Gawain thought it best that they remain on foot. It wasn't long before they found the first trace of civilization, an ancient ruin just at the base of the mountain. Several walls of brick and stone lay on the ground at odd angles, collapsed as if they buckled under their own weight. Vines and mountain vegetation covered the structures, so at first glance they appeared to be nothing more than mossy boulders. The several walls looked like they had been a once mighty fortress, or perhaps a cathedral, but had long since succumbed to nature and been brought to its ruin. Gawain passed by the ancient wreckage without remarking upon it. So after a moment's pause, Rebecca, Sir Byron and Amber followed Gawain along. Amber cleared her throat somewhat nervously. "Hey, boss, We're planning on digging for treasure in the Dark Mountains with only 4 people. Gawain looked at the half-elf. How many more do you think we need? Amber blinked and sputtered. At least a few hundred guards, a dozen master-level rangers and druids for support, knights to take point, mages to oversee from the rear, and at least 1 grandmaster-level bandit like me. Isn't that standard? Gawain smirked. Do you want a treasure hunt or a military campaign? Amber waggled her head back and forth. All right, I was exaggerating a smidge. But it's the Dark Mountains. The Dark Mountains! My mentor used to tell me that it's a place where you find a demon lord every half-mile. You're bringing 3 people with you into the most feared mountain range in Lauren, and one of them can only cast Fireball. Rebecca's face turned bright red. She brandished her staff at Amber. I don't even need fireballs to beat you up. Say that again and I'll show you the power of Cecil women. Amber grinned fiendishly and opened her mouth, but Gawain placed his hand over it. Gawain held out his other hand, warning his many times great-granddaughter from carrying out her threat. She still clutched her staff, but didn't make a move toward the half-elf, who wriggled in her boss's grip. Amber, sooner or later your mouth will be the death of you. He released the bandit, who, to her credit, didn't antagonize the Viscountess. Don't you worry about demon lords. The tales of them in the mountains are just stories of boogeymen to scare children. If there were that many demon lords, then they would have taken over the entire continent already. He continued up the winding path. Rebecca and Amber followed closely behind. Sir Byron stayed back, keeping an eye on where they were before to make sure they hadn't been followed. Gawain continued to talk as the team ventured up the path. The Dark Mountains are dangerous, but not as dangerous as legends have led people to believe. Back during the heyday of Gondolia, before the first Dark Wave, they used to be known as Gold Mountain. But when the Dark Wave occurred, the mountains took the brunt of the elemental storm, which led to the formation of the Black Forest. That's why this became known as the Dark Mountains. He spoke this history lesson partly to educate and reassure his companions, but also to remind himself of knowledge he was still getting used to in his already packed mind. We should steer clear of the Black Forest, which is still teeming with dark magic, but the aberrations that dwell within cannot venture outside, as they rely on chaotic magic to survive. So the northern side of the mountain where we are is safe from such troubles. On their winding route, they passed various plants and trees, some pines, some thistles, also some brambles as well, not unlike the sort of greenery that grows on any mountain. But these plants had a curious quality. Their leaves and twigs were filled with strange colours. Just underneath the bark of the trees and the green skin of the plants were veins of electric blue, blood red, and stormy purple. Colours not naturally occurring in any plant. Also, their branches and stems seemed twisted and thicker than usual. Gawain remembered that Viscount Andrew told him of elemental winds from the wasteland. These must be the effects of wasteland air, which blew from the south every year due to the seasonal winds. Yet apart from a slightly unusual appearance, these plants were not dangerous at all. To demonstrate this, he picked a flower from the ground. Rebecca and Amber gasped, but calmed down once Gawain sniffed it with no ill effects whatsoever. The further they went into the mountains, the thicker the plant seemed to grow, with stumps and vines impeding almost every route. It got to the point where Gawain had to draw the sword of the founder and hack his way through the undergrowth. As he did so, Sir Byron spoke up. People do not fear the Dark Mountains because of old wives' tales, my lord. It is because the Great Barrier and the Sentinel Towers only isolate about 70% of the chaotic energy within the Gondolian wastes. Corrupted forces still leak from there, as our latest encounter did show. Gawain nodded, chopping through some more plants. That makes sense. And then after generations of living under a perceived threat, it becomes part of the culture in the outlying areas, so people stop questioning it. He paused, deep in thought. How many years have these lands been forbidden? Rebecca was the one who answered. If you count from the signing of the decree to when they stopped pioneering, that will be more than 200 years. If you count from the time when all pioneering and settlement rights were revoked, it will be 100 years. Gawain nodded. There you have it. So no one living has seen the true Dark Mountains. Hearing Gawain's reasoning, Amber relaxed. Phew, so the horror stories are all hyperbole and it's quite safe here. Gawain paused. He then whirled on the half-elf, twisting his eyes and mouth in a grotesque expression. I was just joking. This place is dark, dangerous, chaotic, terrifying, and there is a demon lord every half-mile. Amber yelped and vanished into the shadows. Rebecca and Gawain laughed. Sir Byron smirked. Amber reappeared, looking chastened and embarrassed. Gawain put his hands on his hips, a smirk playing across his mouth. What happened to the Grand Master-level bandit? Amber stuck her tongue out at him. Gawain turned and hacked away at the greenery again, then stopped. In the midst of the path lay a large tree, which must have been toppled over in a landslide years before. He bowed and stepped to the side. Madame the Countess, I think your particular skills will be necessary for this obstacle. Rebecca hopped forward excitedly. She raised her staff and crackling flames formed at the top. Amber hid behind Sir Byron. In a moment, Rebecca conjured a giant fireball, which she grabbed with her hands and hurled at the tree trunk. With a loud bang, the fireball blasted the tree trunk apart. Chunks of rotten wood flew all over, and the logs split, toppling down the hill. When the smoke from the blast cleared, the four adventurers found themselves facing a gap in the rocks, seemingly cut by human hands. In fact, the entryway seemed to have once been that of a giant fortress that was carved out of the mountain's very rocks. Amber, who had been scared all the time she was on the road, Rebecca, who had been listening to Gawain's lectures, and Sir Byron, who was on full alert, could not help but stare with eyes wide open at the ancient remnants hidden in the mountain. Gawain walked forward, examining the ruins, and the others followed, still astonished by the discovery. Gawain's eyes roved around and suddenly stopped beside some collapsed stones. He went to the pile of rocks. There was a black thing stuck in the pile that looked fairly out of place. He grabbed it and pulled it from the rocks. Gawain gasped. He held in his hands a sword so rusted that it felt like it would fall apart in his hands at any moment. His eyes fixed back upon the pile of rocks. Alongside it was a line of carvings in the ground, so deep that they were still legible after many years. Gawain bent down and blew some dust off of the carvings. Then he read aloud, 16th Squad, Cole died here. Rebecca peeked around Gawain. What's this? Gawain swallowed. He answered slowly. Back when our pioneering group was crossing the White River, we were being pursued by monsters. The 16th Squad was our rear guard. None survived. Sir Byron grunted. This man probably retreated to the mountains to find high ground, and never made it out. The knight unsheathed his sword and pressed it against his chest, bowing respectfully at the simple tomb. Gawain spent a moment of silence before the tomb. Rebecca bowed her head respectfully. Even Amber remained uncharacteristically silent. After a beat, Gawain picked up a stone and stacked it on top of the pile. You may rest in peace now, Cole. Your efforts were not in vain. At that moment, he wished he could say it in Gawain Cecil's voice, and not in the voice of Gawain Gao, the transmigrator. Then he looked up and saw an arched doorway in the mountain. He stood and dusted himself off. He beckoned to Rebecca. Follow me, I will show you what your ancestors left behind.